Protestants have always been opposed to evolution, right from the very beginning. At least that's what it can seem when we pay attention to the narratives that we hear in the media and on social media and when we read books by new atheists. It seems like Protestantism in general has just always opposed the theory of evolution and the advancement in science in general. But that's not really true. What we find when we go back and look at the historical writings in response to the theory of evolution at the time is a completely different kind of picture. So we're going to talk about it today on the Science and Faith podcast. After the publication of Darwin's book on the origin of species in 1859, there wasn't really much of a dramatic response to it on the part of the church or most Christian theologians. There were several questions and legitimate concerns about Darwin's idea, but there wasn't a dramatic backlash or an immediate call for a rejection of Darwinian ideas. Basically, the Protestant response to Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species had two major concerns. The first major concern was regarding the fixation of species. That is, that because in Genesis, most Protestant theologians at the time were convinced that each reproduced according to its kind, as it states in Genesis. That is, that species can vary within a certain kind, however that is defined, but that species could not change or mutate or transform into other species, but that there was a fixation of the species. And what Darwin's idea did was it essentially blew a huge hole into that idea. And so Protestant theologians naturally had some questions about the legitimacy of either Darwin's idea and the transmutation of species, or the biblical interpretation of what is a kind and what does it mean for things to reproduce according to their kind. And so this issue was taken up and addressed, and it had to be because for the most part, this was a big question in the Protestant theological world. However, it's important to note that secondly, the second main issue that Protestants had was with the issue of divine action or divine guidance, really with teleology within evolution. And what Protestants saw was a problem with Darwinian evolution was that Darwin was basically arguing from a scientific perspective that there was no need for there to be a guider and sustainer of the evolutionary process. There was no need for God to form new species. There was no need for evolution to have a goal or to be working towards something to accomplish an ultimate ends. As Darwin saw it, evolution by natural selection simply happened, and it happened naturally without any kind of interference, divine guidance, or without any kind of teleology or goal that it was trying to achieve or moving towards. And so for Protestant theologians, there was some concern about whether or not Darwinian evolution was inherently atheistic in terms of actually denying the existence of God and the role that he plays in the creation. Now, having stated those two main concerns, it's important to note that Protestant theologians did not have several other concerns with Darwinian evolution, the biggest ones being, first of all, the age of the earth. And by this point, by the mid to late 19th century, after Darwin's publication of his book, most theologians before Darwin even published his book were already in agreement about the age of the earth being somewhat old. And so because of most of this was coming from geologists and the work of geology, of which many were believers and Christians, they were finding that the ages of the earth were indeed very, very long, just given the natural history of geology, of the fossil record. They were noticing that the earth had been around for much longer than Bishop Usher had originally thought, 4004 BC. By this point, there was a growing movement of scholars within Protestant and broader theology, Catholic and Eastern Orthodox as well, that the age of the earth was significantly older than was previously thought. Secondly, there was no real issue with the question of sin before the fall of Adam and Eve. This was not really, as I had Protestant theologians were moving towards this wide acceptance of an old age for the earth. The idea that sin and death and suffering must have existed before the fall of Adam, this was not a question in the mind of most Protestant theologians. This simply wasn't an issue. This was kind of given and taken for granted that the earth being old and having many ages and species having been around and died for hundreds of thousands, even in some cases millions of years, simply was not a problem theologically with the interpretation of Genesis. So these two major issues that most young earth creationists and other creationists cite as strong biblical evidence against the theory of evolution were not even initially on the radar for Protestant theologians as they read and responded to Darwin. The two major issues for them, as we said, were the teleology of evolution, is God the guider of evolution, and of course the question or the concern about the transmutation of species or the fixation of species. These were the two main concerns by Protestant theologians about the theory of evolution. And it wasn't something that immediately got resolved. This wasn't something that people immediately said, oh, okay, well, we can immediately work out the compatibility of this. It took several years, decades, for their of dialogue and research and exploring these ideas and questions. And of course, with Darwin's publication of his subsequent book in 1871, The Descent of Man, in which he strongly argues for the common ancestry of human beings, there were other issues then that came up regarding the uniqueness and the creation of Adam. Did Adam have the image of God? If he, as it says in Genesis, if he did, how does that fit with Darwin's idea that humans share a common ancestor? That then became a third concern of Protestant theologians, was the creation of Adam being created in the image of God. And so there was this ongoing conversation and ongoing dialogue and research that was being done and questions being asked and being answered. And eventually, though, those concerns and questions would be answered and they would be resolved. The transmutation of species, or the fixation of species, as each only being able to reproduce according to their kind, this eventually became no longer a problem for Protestant theologians. They realized that Scripture really wasn't that clear, cut and dry about what that whole concept means of each reproducing according to its kind. What is a kind? How do you define a kind? And is that really what the Bible is even talking about? Is that phrase, each reproduces according to its kind, is that some theological position about the natural world? Is that even a scientific claim that that Genesis is making there? And so that issue eventually would become resolved, where there was some theological importance fixed with that, but not scientific importance, or seeing Genesis as not making a scientific claim in regards to each species reproducing according to its kind. And so this was eventually taken up. The issue of what is Darwinism, that whole question, the compatibility, was taken up by Charles Hodge, who was then the president of Princeton Seminary. And he wrote a book called What is Darwinism, or a little booklet, I guess, and to which he eventually answered the question, well, Darwinism is atheism. But we want to be careful not to just say, okay, so Darwinism, the response by Protestants was that Darwinism was atheism. Well, what Hodge meant by that was more a reaction to the atheists at the time, who were commandeering Darwin's theory and Darwinian evolution to fit the atheistic mindset and model of we don't need God to explain the universe and to explain the world. At the same time, there were also many theologians who were doing that as well, saying, oh, see, look, Darwinism is just proof of evolution. It's just proof of that God doesn't exist, and this is why we have to deny evolution. There were people on both sides, atheists and Christians, who were doing that, kind of commandeering Darwin's ideas and saying this is proof that Darwinism is atheism and we can't accept it. It has to be rejected on the part of Christians. And atheists were saying this is now proof that we know that God doesn't exist. We no longer need God. But overall, I mean, those were minority groups on both sides from a historical perspective that were taking those positions, making those claims. Most Darwinians and most theologians were not making those claims in terms of how evolution worked. Darwinian evolution did not prove that God doesn't exist, did not prove that we don't need God to explain certain things in the natural world. That's not what Darwin was claiming. That's not what evolutionists were claiming at the time. And that's not what most theologians, how they understood the Darwinian theory of evolution. And so what Charles Hodge was doing in his book was essentially saying, if you reject God as having an active role in the propagation of species, in the development of humankind, in God establishing humans as being created in his image, however that actually happened. If you make these assertions and make these denials about God's role in existence, then essentially Darwinian evolution is atheism, and it has to be rejected. But if we make accommodation for the existence and presence of God working in and through evolution, then evolution is simply a natural phenomenon by which God creates in the natural world. And so that kind of just gives you a brief snapshot of the overview of what the Protestant response to evolution was. It wasn't until much later in the early 20th century with the rise of fundamentalism, and then eventually out of a reaction of fundamentalism, kind of a middle road between fundamentalism and liberalism, came evangelicalism, that you started to actually get more of a pushback on Darwinian evolution on the issue of the authority of Scripture, literal interpretations of Genesis. That didn't come until after the 20th century. The initial response by Protestant theologians to the idea of evolution by natural selection was simply to raise some questions about the transmutation and fixation of species, and the role of God as guider and of evolutionary process to an end or a goal. And those issues were resolved before the 20th century, or shortly thereafter. And so, by and large, the Protestant reaction to the theory of evolution was to raise some questions, to do some research, and then resolve those issues, which they eventually were. And it wasn't until much later, with the rise of fundamentalism and evangelicalism, that the issue of evolution being a problem with being compatible with the Bible or with Christian theology then became a problem and rose again to prominence in the middle of the 20th century. And then eventually, with the publication of The Genesis Flood by Henry Morris and the rise of fundamentalists and evangelicalism in America, did we see this idea that evolution was incompatible with the Bible and Christianity. However, that was not the case when early Protestant theologians first encountered the theory of evolution. They didn't have the same questions or concerns that later fundamentalists and evangelicals had. And so I think as Protestants, I think we need to take that into consideration when we look at the theory of evolution and say that Protestant theologians didn't have these objections, these concerns, and these questions that modern fundamentalists and evangelicals have with the theory of evolution. And so I think it's worth noting that if the early Protestant theological response to evolution was mostly positive and eventually resolved any issues or tensions that they had with the theory of evolution, I don't really see much reason for us to continue to kind of beat this dead horse of this idea that evolution is incompatible with the Christian faith or with the Bible. So that's our podcast for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have a question or a comment, feel free to leave it in the comment section down below. And of course, if you are a pastor or theologian or an educated layperson within somewhere in the wide spectrum of Protestantism, and you have some questions or ideas or suggestions or comments to make, you can send me an email. The email address to do that is scienceandfaithdortmund@gmail.com. You can leave a comment below, and we'll do our best to kind of interact with you on that. And also check out our website. We have some more articles coming out on these topics of the historical response to evolution. And also we're going to be looking at not just the denominational responses, but also the theological responses to evolution. What are the different theological responses and how do they interpret and make sense of evolutionary theory? So check out our website. The website there is scienceandfaith.de. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and we look forward to seeing you next time.